Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again this week Daniel McAdams. Thank you for joining me, Daniel.
Thanks for having me back, Jay. It's always fun to talk to you.
It's always very, very interesting to have you on the show. If it's fun talking to you for sure, but the topics that you have to talk about are not always fun, and they're not happy topics, but they are what they are. So much of what we talk about in the show, it's not good news, but it's news, and it's truthful news. And I think that, as the good book says, the truth will set you free. Yeah. So that's the premise that I operate under, and I know you do, and I know Ron Paul does as well. So let's get into some of the truth that you can help our listeners understand. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the Ukraine. If you could give us a little bit of an update on Ukraine and perhaps northern Iraq.
Sure. What I think is most important about Ukraine is that the U.S. and the Western narrative is sort of going off the rails. They seem to have lost their way. And we've seen so many lies that have come out of Kiev that have been repeated by the U.S. and the Western governments and media. And now it's on a daily basis. I've been following over the past few days. If your readers, I'm sure, or your listeners are aware, the Russians sent in a convoy, a humanitarian aid convoy. And the U.S. from the beginning had been suggesting that it was a Trojan horse, it was full of weapons.
Yep.
And all of these things, and predicting the worst would happen. And then when it finally crossed the border, the U.S. was screaming about violations of Ukrainian sovereignty. And as it turns out, they basically drove these trucks to Lugansk, which had been under siege, offloaded the humanitarian assistance, which had been inspected on the border by Ukrainian border guards and by Western journalists who found nothing wrong. They offloaded this stuff and turned around and went back to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But the U.S. and especially people like NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen, they seem desperate and hysterical. Rasmussen said that a Russian column of military vehicles had transported into Ukraine and was fighting Ukraine. No verification. He's basically said that 3 or 4 times. Basically, almost every day they're saying this. But strangely enough, in this world of cell phones, nobody seems to be able to even capture a picture of these things. Now, I'm certainly willing to believe it, but I've seen these lies before, so you do have to give some proof.
Daniel, let me stop you there because this is very interesting what you're saying, because all we're hearing here in our mainstream press is that that's what it is. It's a Trojan horse, and there's no. And my wife and I were watching. We have so many channels here in New York City in our cable system, but there was a Chinese channel that speaks in English that delivers the message in English, but it's a Chinese network, and they were talking about how peaceful it was and how exactly what you were saying, that there was verified by independent people, that it wasn't, there weren't weapons going into the Ukraine, and yet we never heard that from our side. I guess it doesn't matter what Putin does; he's a bad guy.
Yeah, and it's not to say that he's a good guy, but it's to say that they're lying, and they're lying so consistently that just today I noticed that one of the major international press outlets said that Russia had invaded Ukraine with a force of 10 tanks.
Yeah,
which is. If Russia is going to invade Ukraine, which I don't believe it has any interest in doing because nobody wants Ukraine now, it's messed up.
Yeah.
But if they did do it, it would be with a lot more
than 10 tanks.
It's just, it's almost insulting to our intelligence. But to see someone like the NATO Secretary General repeating these stories as if they're absolute fact, it makes me wonder about his judgment. This is a guy who has significant military power at his disposal, and he's acting as if he's unhinged. And should be worried about it, I think.
All right. So where do we go? What happens in Ukraine now? What's your hunch in the next week or two?
Well, there has been a major counterattack launched by the rebels starting yesterday, and they've really blasted forth toward the coastline toward Mariupol. They've surrounded several battalions of Ukrainian armed forces, and supposedly up to 5 to 7,000 of them are trapped. So it's a major counteroffensive. From what I can see, from what we've seen in the reporting, I don't know what happens with it. They go back and forth. The Ukrainian economy is in absolute free fall. I'm sure your readers have seen some of the information out of Ukraine.
Sure.
They've had to prop up their currency. They've had to raise the interest rates to from I think 7% to now 17%. Try to keep that currency from just absolute free fall. They are spending the money that the IMF and World Bank is loaning them to just simply survive. They're spending all of that money instead on military equipment.
Oh.
They're basically, it's like it's like having an uncle who all of his credit cards are totally maxed out, yet he wants to go look at a Rolls-Royce dealership.
Right.
They say that they want to spend $2 billion additional dollars to refit their military.
Oh.
And
so they can suppress the people in the East that are the pro-Russian folks.
Well, they're not even just. I mean, pro-Russian. It's more than that. They just simply don't want to be ruled from Kiev anymore after the coup that the U.S. sponsored in March. They view these people as illegitimate.
Sure. Yeah.
So for whatever reason, as Dr. Paul always says, if people want to break away and secede and break up bigger governmental entities into smaller ones, that should, at least for libertarians, that should be considered a good thing.
Yeah.
So this whole sort of subsidiarity idea is good too. But this forced suppression of this movement has left thousands of people dead. Several 100,000 refugees have streamed into Russia, and they've flattened. They're just simply hurling shells into the center of these big cities. It really is like what we're seeing in Gaza. That's similar of a situation. It's just horrific.
In the eastern Ukraine are getting hit all the time, I guess.
All the time,
Yeah. By the United States supported Ukrainian government.
Sure, and and the U.S. has been openly supporting this government. They've been openly sending them U.S. advisors, telling them how to win this war, U.S. equipment. And it's funny that it's not escalation when we do it with our guys. Yeah. But if anyone else were to help the other side, it would, they'd scream to high heavens about escalating the situation.
Right. The aggressive Putin is becoming more aggressive now, and so on and so forth. But we're not aggressive here in America. We love people, and we're doing it all for their good. So let's just, yeah. Well, anyway, so that's the Ukraine. What about Iraq? What's happening there?
Well, it's the continuation of the bombing. Its expansion. It was called mission creep, and I wrote a little bit about this past week. Just when everyone was thinking about mission creep in Iraq and talking about mission creep, all of a sudden this video emerges that purported to be an American journalist being beheaded by an ISIS member. This Islamist militia. Now we're seeing several media outlets, many media outlets, are now saying that this video appears to be staged. It's a fake video. And this is not fringe sites. This is the Telegraph. This is the Times of London. These are major mainstream news sources that are saying it appears to be faked. Not saying that the guy wasn't killed. Not saying anything else. Just saying that the way it was presented is not the way it happened.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's been used as the biggest casus belli for the U.S. to launch another war in the Middle East, which
sure.
they're very, very quickly doing. And the latest now is the U.S. push to begin bombing Syria.
Right.
They've had their sights on Syria for years. They almost were able to do it last year with this gas attack. And now, because of this video, surprise, surprise, they're openly talking about, bombing a foreign sovereign country.
That's incredible. So there doesn't seem to be any let up here, Daniel. Everything is getting hotter and hotter, and everywhere we go seems to be more catastrophic after we've meddled. I mean, I think I saw you had written an article here on Tripoli as well. That I guess in fact what's happened is the bad guys, ISIS or who is it? They're Egyptians or somebody that's been bombing the Tripoli airport?
The bad guys of the day. Well, when the U.S. invaded and bombed Libya, it was to promote democracy and to bring peace and freedom to the Libyan people. And what they've done is they've turned Libya into Somalia, but even worse. This is the absolute worst disaster of U.S. interventionism. And instead of recognizing it, they try to ignore it. But Syria is ruled by a bunch of different competing gangs, one of which is run by a former Libyan army general with very strong ties to the CIA in his past. Who knows if those are gone? And then you have the Islamist militias, and then the bombing you referred to that just came out early this week that United Arab Emirates and Egypt had been cooperating to have some fighter runs, some bomber runs over Libya, bombing those Islamists in Libya.
Jeez.
And, but the big thing is, what's very interesting about this is that they did not tell the U.S. they were doing this. They didn't clear it to the U.S. And that, of course, makes the U.S. furious. But at the same time, the U.S. has been the one that has armed the UAE and Egypt as well. So on one hand, we arm you, we train you, but we expect you to do what you're told. I forget who it was. Someone I was reading today drew some very interesting parallels between that and ISIS, which is exactly what the U.S. did with the people who became ISIS. They were being trained in Jordan. They were being trained in Turkey. They were being armed. Many of them were trained in Benghazi, as a matter of fact, by the U.S. But now all of a sudden they're not doing what we wanted them to do, and so we have to start bombing them and bombing our own weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, what's happening is interventionism is exploding right before our eyes, but nobody recognizes, few people recognize it, and that's the huge task that's before the Ron Paul Institute and people like yourself and so many others, is to try to get people to realize that all of these problems have a common cause. Interventionism, the idea, this crazy idea that you can remake the entire world just according to your own will.
Well, here's the craziness of it to me, Daniel. It's the idea that we can force people into democracy. I mean that just seems counterintuitive to me. Democracy is first of all, democracy is, I think, mobocracy, but certainly we had a republic which was, set up in America, but there was a respect for each other. That is a libertarian mindset, I think, that said that, I'm free to do what I want and to pursue and to lead my life the way I think it's best to lead it, as long as I don't injure someone else. And here we go, we say we want democracy, which I think is, people don't really understand what it is, but they think it's something that's supposed to be kind and good for people. And we go and bomb the hell out of people, kill hundreds of thousands of people with our bombs and our drones and all kinds of war tragedies that occur, and not to mention our own injuries and blood and treasure that's lost. So it seems to me a contradiction, really, to think that we can just force other countries to do to force them into being like us, which they can never be anyway. But, a very interesting article, or I guess this was really an interview that you did with Lou Rockwell on the Lou Rockwell Show. And the little blurb that told people about what your interview was about, it says the wheels are coming off of the U.S. empire. And is that why, Daniel, that the empire is almost like a frightened, injured animal that is desperate and needs to strike out and try to get more territory to support its addiction, its debt addiction? That's sort of the way I look at it. But how do you, when you say the wheels are coming off the U.S. empire, could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's like you were just saying a minute ago, Jay. It was each one of these interventions are producing an effect that's even worse than the original cause that led the U.S. to intervene. But I'm sitting here looking at my computer screen as we talk, and I see here's John Bolton on Fox News going on as if he were some expert on what's happening in Iraq. This is the guy who screwed it up in the first place. And who do they call when they want someone to come and tell them how to fix it. The same idiot who messed it up.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I mean, and he's saying, we underestimate the strength of ISIS, and this sort of thing. These guys are the ones who messed this whole place up. Yet the media still goes directly to them. I mean, they haven't called me. They haven't called you, Jay. I'm pretty sure. They don't want to hear anyone who warned against it. They've not, they do call Ron Paul at times, thankfully, but they certainly don't make any effort to really look at why everything is falling apart.
No.
Anything the wheels coming off is that they're accelerating the process.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's astonishing to me.
It is astonishing, Daniel, but it's consistent with what I see on the economic side of things too. We continue with the same policies; they don't work. Some people have defined insanity as continuing to do the same thing and expecting different results. So that seems to be both on domestic policy as well as foreign policy. You almost have to think that there's some power somewhere that wants things to fall apart, that wants the wheels to come off, because it's just so illogical, our policies everywhere we go, and it's so hurtful. Well, I can remember as a guy who was quite young during the Vietnam War when the protests were raging, and at a time when actually our news media, at least part of the mainstream media, dared to question the government's policies. That doesn't seem to be much at all happening anymore. But at that time there was Senator Fulbright, who talked about how, in fact, if we're going to go to Vietnam and bomb the hell out of those people and kill people and spoil their environment, do everything else we did that war does to people in their countries, that in fact we're going to suffer some consequences ourselves. That is self-destructive. It's not only a matter of destroying people overseas and our perceived enemy, but it's also going to take a toll on us domestically. Now, it's easy to see how that's the case when people come back with injured legs and arms and blown off legs and arms, and the huge amounts of trillions of dollars we're spending to kill people, try to take over their countries. But Ron Paul has written an article here that I think really hits on this topic, in my mind anyway. I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. And this is Ferguson, The War Comes Home. Could you maybe elaborate on or share with our listeners Ron's couple of his major points there in that article?
Sure. I mean, you captured it pretty well in your intro. It's the idea that this behavior overseas, where the use of force is the first option rather than the first and only option rather than the last option, has now come home with the militarization of the police. Mm-hmm. And it started really with the drug war that we had to give our local police forces much more sophisticated weaponry because of the drug war. And then it accelerated after 9/11 with the war on terror. Well, the local cops have got to get tanks. They've got to get, grenade launchers and anti-mine vehicles. And Dr. Paul has said, if you arm the police with military equipment, don't be surprised when they behave like the military.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing in Ferguson. And unfortunately, a lot of people, I think a lot on the left perhaps, they want to make what's happened there about race. And where that certainly may well be a part of it, the real lesson for those of us with a more libertarian or anti-state bent is the real danger of turning local police into a nationalized, militarized police force. The danger of the federal government being involved in local police, which they have no constitutional right to do. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think probably the left is trying to make a race issue out of it to an extent, no doubt. But I think there's also something good happening here, possibly, Daniel, in that some of the left is starting to also talk about the dangers of too much military equipment in the hands of local police. It's as if you felt you had to arm the local police because now their enemies are internal, they're inside America. And if anything, I would say that may be true in part because of what Ron Paul talked about. The reason they're over here is because we're over there.
Yeah.
And so, so to a certain extent, when I hear some of the neocons say, it's going to happen again, I say, yeah, you might be right about that, and one of the reasons you might be right about it is because we continue to kill tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of innocent people overseas with our war machinery. So why wouldn't it happen here? You know,
Yeah.
in a way, you have to say, but so what does that mean? Again, I think Fulbright was right because he was saying when we go over there and start doing those things over there, it's going to come back and hit us here. And it seems to me that this thing that Ron Paul was writing about is part of that blowback, perhaps.
Absolutely, Jay. No, you hit it right on the head. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's hey, look, we're in such a small minority now. I just know it. I sense it. I feel it. And I think I was talking to a small group of friends the other night, and a local politician in New Jersey was basically harassed by the police because of his positions, a libertarian position on various things in New Jersey. I just have a sense, Daniel, that this is something that's getting bigger and bigger in America, and people better be ready for it. I think we need to do what we can to try to let our friends and family know. But, people are afraid. They're intimidated to a certain extent. This gentleman was intimidated, basically run out of the city council where he was operating. And so, I think we got to just keep trying as hard as we can to let people know what's going on and shed the light. And, of course, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity is doing that, but it can't do it without some resources. And Ron Paul just had a birthday, or I guess his birthday is, when was his birthday?
It was the 20th, actually.
The 20th. Okay.
Yeah.
The young ex-congressman from Texas. Now he is very young in terms of his stature and his health and all that. But he has a birthday, and he has also made an offer to people, and that is if they contribute. If they want to send him a birthday present, they can do it in the form of a contribution to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And in return, I understand he is providing an autographed book. Would you care to talk about that a little bit, Daniel?
Sure, yeah, it's something that he decided to do. Actually, we talked him into it, to be honest. He's kind of shy about these kinds of things, but the idea is to have people send something to something that he feels strongly about, which is his institute that promotes peace, and he wanted to provide people with some incentive to do that. So he's personalizing and signing books to anyone who contributes at minimum of $100.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people have contributed more, which we very much appreciate. But his book is The Foreign Policy of Freedom. This is the foreign policy book that he did a few years back. That was wonderful collection of a lot of his speeches and things, and really, if you look at some of those things, it's amazing how relevant they are today, how he predicted things. So these are not a bunch of old speeches. These are things that you can look at to see what's happening now, because he was talking about it years ago.
So has he taken speeches that he made on the floor of the House and put them into the book? Is that, or other speeches as well?
Yeah, exactly. It's a number of different speeches.
Mm-hmm.
There's an introduction by Lou Rockwell to the book, so it's just a neat thing to have. I enjoy going back and reading these speeches, these things that he said, things that he's written, and I think everyone does. You see so many things that are posted on the internet, even videos of him on the floor saying, "Hey, Ron Paul was saying this 10 years ago."
Yeah,
so,
that's right. He's been spot on with foreign policy as well as domestic policies. No question about it. That people don't want to pay attention and learn from that. Well, it's, I guess, to their own peril, but it's the peril of the nation. And anyway, I would just note to our listeners that the book also has, as I'm looking at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace, it's ronpaulinstitute.org. The cover of the book looks like it has perhaps our founding fathers on it, so I would gather that Ron was trying to make the point of that we've strayed so far away from what our Constitution calls for and what the founding fathers had in mind when they formed our country. Absolutely.
No, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
We need to go back to that.
Well, we sure do. I mean, we can hope and pray that we will. I don't know. We have to keep trying, I guess. And I think that to me, to you, to Ron Paul, to others that we have on this show, I think truth is the ultimate value that they hold. And so I want to thank you once again, Daniel, for helping us to to come to understand what is really going on in these different hot spots around the world. And geopolitically, I don't know of anybody that can help us do that better than you do. So thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us once again.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's wonderful. Thank you.